Welcome to Excel Intuition. I'm Suzanne. This module looks at lookup functions. We're going to look at two different lookup functions. VLOOKUP for looking things up in a vertical column, and HLOOKUP for looking values up in a horizontal row. Both VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP have the same number of arguments. The first argument is the lookup value that you want to look up in the table array, which is the second argument. And then there's an index number as a third argument to each function. It's a column index number in the VLOOKUP and a row index number in the HLOOKUP. So the idea is when you find the lookup value in the column of the table array for a VLOOKUP, you're looking in the very first column of the table array. You're always looking in the leftmost column for a match. Once you find it, you'll be in a specific row of the table array, and the column index number tells you which column of that row you want the value returned from as the result of the function's lookup. The range lookup argument is an optional argument, and if you don't use it, it defaults to a value of true, and that means you aren't looking for an exact match to your lookup. You're looking for a range match. With the HLOOKUP, we've got the lookup value as the first argument, the table array is the second, but in this case the table array is arranged so that we'll be looking for the lookup value in the top row of the table. And when we find the value in a particular column in that top row, then the row index number says which row of that column we want the value returned from. And the range lookup argument works the same way here, that if we don't use it, it defaults to true, and then we want a range lookup instead of an exact match lookup. If the range lookup argument is set to false, we want an exact match in our lookup. And we're going to see an example of exact match lookups, and then we'll see one example of a range lookup. So in the first example, we have two cities in a mini report, and we want to look up their sales tax rate for the cities. And the table that we have for the sales tax rates is a vertical table in that the city names are in a vertical column. So once you find the name, a match to a name, you see the sales tax rate is in column 2 of the same table. So the VLOOKUP argument here uses as its first argument, the lookup value is the city name that we see in B7. The sales tax table array is the second argument, and we see that we're telling it to give us the value from column 2 of that table. The range lookup argument is false, meaning we want an exact match lookup. We're not going to get an answer from this function if there isn't a name that exactly matches the name Salinas in that table. So if we have this set up so that you can choose the name from a drop-down list, so you really don't have the possibility of entering a name that there won't be a match for. If we go back to this sales tax table, you can see the range that has been defined for the table array if you choose that named range from the name box. And we can see it's C4 down to E13. And if we choose a different name from this list, we'll get a different tax rate. Now in the HLOOKUP example, we're looking up a value from a different table, and we've got the same layout of two different city names, but we're looking up a percent of persons in poverty in these cities according to the U.S. Census data gathered. So that table is on this worksheet called City Demographics. And we see that our city names are organized in a row instead of a column. And then the data associated with them is in the rows below that. And the row that we're looking a value up from is all the way at the bottom of the table in row 9 of the table. The percent of persons in poverty according to the U.S. Census data. And there's a link to the webpage that has that data available if you'd like to look at it further. I'm going to show you the table array here also. It's the city demo table array. And you can see it does not include the column with the names of the values in the rows. It includes D3, where the city names start, over to M11. Those are the rows in this table array. So our HLOOKUP function, the lookup value is the city name again. The city demo table array is that table array that I just showed you. And then the row that has the persons in poverty value that we want returned once we find a match to the lookup value is row 9. The false indicates that we must find an exact match. If there wasn't an exact match, this function would return an error. Now I have another lookup example here where we'll use a range lookup for a VLOOKUP. In this case, I have a little report that we're asking to have a poverty rating displayed here, a message that says whether the city in this column has a persons in poverty value, percent value, less than the U.S. overall percent of persons in poverty, or greater than or equal to the U.S. persons in poverty percent. And let me go back to the city demographics table and show you that value. We've got values for cities in Monterey County with a population over 5,000 in this table. But then we have values for the U.S. as a whole in this column on the left. And that persons in poverty percent is at the bottom of the column. 11.6 was the percent according to the U.S. Census from 2017 to 2021. That's the percent of persons in poverty in the U.S. as a whole. So on this example, we want to compare the percent of persons in poverty in the city in this column to the percent of persons in poverty in the U.S. as a whole. So we've got a table over here that has 0 at the bottom and 11.6 as the second value in the table. This is organized vertically, the value 0 and the value of U.S. persons in poverty percent. And there's a comment here that explains what it is as well. So the way a range lookup works, you take a value to a table and you compare it one by one to the values in the column or the row, if it was an HLOOKUP, and you say, is this value greater than or equal to this value? If it's not, your table wouldn't, if the value you're taking to the lookup is not greater than or equal to the first value in the table, you would have an immediate error because the table wouldn't be set up properly. For a range lookup, the table has to be in ascending order, and the first value has to be less than or equal to the value you want to find a lookup match for. So the way VLOOKUP with a range match works, it compares with the first value, says, is it greater than or equal? And if that's true, it continues on. It looks to the second value. It says, is it greater than or equal? In this case, it would be true that it was greater than or equal to 0, and it would be true that it was greater than or equal to 11.6. And there's no further entries in this table, so it would stop here. And this would be the message. Greater than or equal to U.S. persons in poverty percent. And that's the message that we see right here. Now in the second column, with the same lookup process, we take this value. Is it greater than or equal to 0? Yes. Is it greater than or equal to 11.6? No. So it stops here, and this would be the message returned from column 2. And we can see that there's 3 arguments here: the lookup value, the table array, which is these 4 cells, and then 2 is the column to return a value from once the range match is found. So now we're going to apply these different lookups to a new little report, and I recommend, if you haven't already done so, you download your own copy of this companion file and try this on your own before watching the demonstration of the solutions. So here we have, again, 2 different cities to be compared with each other. You can choose from a drop-down list different names for the columns as you wish. I'm trying to, okay. And then the first value we want to compare is their sales tax rates. And we know that that sales tax is on this table, and that it's a vertical table, and we know the name of the table, sales tax table array. So in this report, we're going to make a VLOOKUP function looking up the name of the city. And since we know the name of the table array, we can start typing it. If I just type an S, I'll get choices that start with S to choose from, and I can just double click on this table array to put it into my formula. Then I also remember that the sales tax rate is in column 2 of the table once the name of the city is found, and I want an exact match. I don't want a city named close to the name of the city I'm looking at, but I want it to be exactly the name I'm looking at. So I'm putting false for the range lookup argument. And I can drag this to this column because the reference to B4 is going to change to C4 because it's a relative reference, and when I move the formula, it will change relative to being in a new column. Now, the approximate population value is in a different table array. It's not in the sales tax table array. Now I'm going to be looking things up in the city demographics table array. And that's a horizontal lookup because the city names are arranged in a horizontal row at the top of the table. And I see that the population estimates are in row 2 of the table. So I'm going to use my HLOOKUP. And my lookup value is again the city. But this time I'm noticing that a number of values are going to come from the same table and use the same lookup value. And I'd like to be able to create a formula I could drag down this column and just change the row index number, not have to create the formula from scratch. If I want to do that, I need to change this reference to the lookup value to be a mixed reference instead of a completely relative reference, because I don't want the row of the reference to change when I drag it down. I still want the column to change when I drag it to the right. So if I click my F4 key, that would be an absolute reference that wouldn't change at all, but then it wouldn't change to C4 when I move it to the right. So I'm going to make a mixed reference. The $sign in front of the 4 means that will not change, but the B will be allowed to change if the relative reference, if the formula moves to a new location. The table array I want is the city demo table array. And for the population, I want values from the second row. So I'm using 2 as my row index. And again, I want an exact match lookup. And I can formulate this to look like a number and with a comma. And I don't need those extra decimal places. Now, the next value I want is owner-occupied housing unit rate. What percent of housing is occupied by owners of those houses in these cities? Now, I copied this straight down. I have to change my index number to the correct row, and that is row 3. And then I'm going to want to change my formatting because this needs to be formatted as a percent, not as a whole number. And I'm going to add a little decimal place there. So now I'm going to drag this down again. This time I want the median gross rent, which is in row 5. So I'm going to change the 3 to a 5. And change it from a percent to a dollar value. Take away the decimal places this time. Here the value, this is a percent value again, this persons without health insurance. So I'm going to copy the formula from where I already have it formatted as a percent to make this transition smoother. And this is coming from row 6, so I changed my row index from 3 to 6. And this is the percent of persons without health insurance under the age of 65 in this town of Pacific Grove. Now the next value I want is the median household income in 2021 dollars from the census period of 2017 to 2021. So I'm going to copy the formula from one that I've already formatted as dollars and then changed my row index to 8, which is the row where that information is stored. And then the persons in poverty is also a percent, so I'm going to copy from a percent formatted cell. but change my row index to 9 because that's row 9 of the table where that value is stored. And then the rating I'm going to get from the same table that we had it when we had this example of the range lookup. So I'm comparing here this percent to the US percent of persons in poverty. So I'm going to use a VLOOKUP. My lookup value is this percent. I'm going to do a relative, I'm going to just leave it as is because I'm only going to copy it over to the cell to the right, so I don't have to make it a mixed reference. I'm going to use the poverty level table array. I want column 2, and this is a range lookup, so I don't have to define the fourth argument, but I can explicitly say true for a quote approximate match. And I get the message here that this town poverty rate of 5.6% is below the US persons in poverty percent. If I drag this to the right, I see that this town of Soledad is also below the US persons in poverty percent. We see that this message is wider than the cell, so we can wrap the text and maybe make this a little bit deeper row. And then we'll wrap this one too. So that is the end of that example. I'm going to return to the intro page. Go ahead and try that on your own again if you haven't done it completely yet. And I welcome any questions or comments or suggestions that you might like to offer. Thank you.